She escaped from a convent in the middle of the reign, and the most powerful magnate hid her in his mansion. Chicago, Illinois, November 1886. The wind howled through the iron gates of St. Mary's Convent like a thing possessed, carrying with it the fury of a November tempest that seemed to shake the very foundations of faith itself. Inside the stone chapel, midnight bells tolled with a solemnity that had guided the rhythm of Evangeline Shaw's existence for 7 long years. She knelt upon the cold stone floor, her black habit absorbing the dampness that seeped through the ancient walls. Her fingers wrapped around wooden prayer beads worn smooth by countless women who had preceded her in this life of voluntary imprisonment, dressed as divine calling. Before we continue, I invite you to subscribe and turn on the bell. On this channel, we bring back romances from past eras, where honor, destiny, and love shaped the course of life. The truth that had shattered her world lay hidden in the convent archives, discovered mere hours before in a sealed letter yellowed by decades of concealment. Her mother's handwriting, unmistakable and cruel in its precision, revealed the terrible secret that had condemned her to this existence. There was no scandal. There had never been a scandal. The indiscretion, the shame, the desperate need to remove her from society, all of it was a fabrication, a convenient lie constructed to hide something far more damaging to the Shaw family's carefully maintained reputation. Evangeline was not being punished for a sin she had committed. She was being erased for a sin she had never committed at all. The realization had crystallized into something crystalline and sharp within her chest, cutting through the fog of acceptance she had maintained for 7 years. She could no longer breathe within these walls. She could no longer pretend that obedience was piety or that silence was virtue. The woman who rose from the chapel floor was no longer the traumatized girl of 18 who had arrived at the convent gates in tears. She was 28 years old, educated through countless hours spent among the convent library's treasured books, and she possessed a hunger for truth that no amount of prayer could satisfy. The corridors of the convent were familiar, yet suddenly foreign as she moved through them with deliberate purpose. Her hands trembled as she exchanged her habit's heavy wool scapular for a simple black cloak borrowed from the laundry room, her heart thundering so violently she feared the sound would betray her. Sister Margot, who supervised the dormitory, slept deeply in her cell, her rhythmic breathing providing cover for Evangeline's movements. The other sisters were lost in their own troubled dreams, unaware that one of their number was about to abandon the vows that bound them all to this place of stone and silence. The November rain began as she reached the outer gate. At first, tentative droplets that soon transformed into a torrent of biblical proportions. The iron bars of the gate seemed almost alive in the darkness, twisted shapes that appeared to reach toward her like accusing fingers. But Evangeline pushed forward, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her legs remembering how to run despite 7 years of careful, measured walks through the convent gardens. The world beyond the gate was vast and terrifying and infinitely more real than anything she had known since adolescence. The streets of Chicago sprawled before her, gaslit and rain-slicked, stretching into shadows she could scarcely comprehend. She had been only 11 years old when she left this city. Her memories of it were fragmented, dreamlike. Now it appeared as a foreign country, thrumming with the energy of 10,000 lives, the distant sounds of trains and industry, creating a symphony that was nothing like the monastic chanting she had learned to accept as music. The rain plastered her black cloak against her body, and her feet, accustomed only to the convent's polished floors and carefully raked gardens, stumbled across cobblestones that seemed determined to throw her down. She did not know where she was running toward, only that she was running away. Away from the lies. Away from the walls that had contained not only her body, but her very ability to imagine an existence beyond them. away from the priesthood and the sisters and the terrible machinery of faith that had been weaponized against her by her own blood. Exhaustion began to claim her limbs after what seemed like hours of running through the rain-soaked streets. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her vision began to blur at the edges. She stumbled once, twice, her hands scraping against the rough brick of a warehouse wall. When she glimpsed the iron gates of a mansion through the downpour, it seemed almost dreamlike, a vision conjured by her desperate mind. The gates towered above her, wrought iron fashioned into elaborate scrollwork, and beyond them lay a structure that seemed to belong to another world entirely. 3 stories of Romanesque revival architecture rose against the stormy sky, its windows dark except for a single light burning somewhere within. Evangeline grasped the iron bars of the gate, her fingers slipping against the wet metal. She tried to call out, but her voice emerged as little more than a whisper, swallowed by the thunder that rolled across the Chicago sky. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she felt herself sliding downward, her back against the cold metal of the gate. The rain continued its relentless assault, and darkness crept in at the edges of her consciousness like an ocean tide. She had escaped the convent only to collapse in the wilderness of the city, alone and afraid and utterly uncertain what came next. Behind the mansion's walls, in a study lined with leather-bound books and illuminated by a dying fire, James Blackwood sat reviewing contracts that would determine the fate of 1,000 workers in the Pittsburgh steel mills. He was a man of 42 years, whose face bore the marks of that age, silver threading through his dark hair, lines etched around eyes that had learned to calculate profit from human suffering. He did not hear the storm outside his window, nor did he notice when his staff came rushing to report a woman collapsed at his gates. It was only when Eleanor Hartwell, his housekeeper of 15 years, appeared in his study with rain dripping from her grey wool cloak that he looked up from his papers, unaware that the moment was about to arrive that would change the entire trajectory of his life. The fever broke on the 3rd day, leaving Evangeline drenched in perspiration that soaked through the fine linen sheets of a bed she had never imagined could exist. The room around her gradually came into focus as consciousness returned. High ceilings adorned with intricate plasterwork, windows draped in heavy velvet of the deepest emerald, and sunlight filtering through lace curtains that cast delicate shadows across the mahogany furniture. She lay motionless for several minutes, her mind struggling to reconcile the luxury surrounding her with the desperate flight through rain-soaked streets that was her last clear memory. A woman entered the room carrying a porcelain pitcher, her movements efficient and practiced. She was older, with iron-grey hair pinned in a severe bun, and her black dress and white apron identified her as a servant. Yet something in her bearing suggested she held considerable authority within this household. Eleanor Hartwell had been managing James Blackwood's mansion for 15 years, and in that time she had learned to read people the way other women read embroidery patterns. She studied Evangeline with an expression that was neither judgmental nor particularly sympathetic, but rather pragmatically assessing. "You're awake," Eleanor said, setting the pitcher on a small table beside the bed. "Mr. Blackwood will want to know. You've been unconscious for 3 days. The fever was quite severe. There were moments we thought—" She paused, seeming to decide that completing the thought would serve no useful purpose. "You're fortunate. Pneumonia takes many. You simply needed rest and warmth." Evangeline's throat was parched, her voice emerging as little more than a whisper when she attempted to speak. "Where am I? How did I— She could not complete the sentence, confusion and fear warring within her chest. Eleanor poured water from the pitcher into a delicate crystal glass and held it to Evangeline's lips, an unexpectedly tender gesture from a woman whose appearance suggested tenderness was not her default manner. "You collapsed at the gates during the storm. Mr. Blackwood's staff brought you inside. He ordered the doctor to attend you immediately. Eleanor's tone was matter-of-fact, but there was something beneath the words, a careful neutrality that suggested she understood far more than she was saying. You were calling out in your sleep. Fragments of Latin. Prayers, mostly. She allowed the words to settle between them like stones dropped into still water. I knew what you were before you ever opened your eyes. The knowledge that her secret was visible, that her very nature had been broadcast through fever dreams and Latin incantations, sent a chill through Evangeline despite the warmth of the room. She wanted to deny it, to fabricate an explanation, but the exhaustion that still clung to her made deception impossible. I had to leave, she said instead. The words tumbling out as though her body needed to confess what her mind could not yet fully articulate. There was a reason. I had no choice. Eleanor settled herself into a chair beside the bed with the confidence of someone accustomed to hearing confessions. Mr. Blackwood doesn't employ his staff to ask questions about his guests. We are paid to be discreet, to maintain the household, and to forget what we observe. She smoothed her apron with deliberate precision. That said, there are certain realities we must address. You cannot remain here indefinitely as a mysterious invalid. Questions will be asked. The household staff is already curious, and the merchants who deliver to this house are even more so. Over the following hours, as Evangeline's strength gradually returned, Eleanor outlined the fiction that would become Evangeline's salvation. She would be introduced as James Blackwood's distant cousin from Boston, recently widowed and in need of a period of rest before returning to her family. The identity was carefully constructed, close enough to explain her presence within the household without requiring extensive social engagement, yet distant enough that few would feel obligated to verify the details. As for her current employment, Eleanor suggested that Evangeline might serve as James's private secretary, a position that would occupy her time and provide her with a plausible reason for the hours she would spend in proximity to the master of the house. Mr. Blackwood has been without a secretary since his previous one married and moved to Philadelphia 6 months ago, Eleanor explained. It is a position of some responsibility. The work is administrative, nothing beyond the capabilities of an educated woman. The salary is modest, but sufficient for your needs. Mr. Blackwood has agreed to this arrangement. The revelation that James Blackwood had not only sheltered her, but had orchestrated her integration into his household, struck Evangeline with unexpected force. She had imagined him as a distant philanthropist, moved by some impulse of charity toward a desperate woman. The reality that he had actively participated in constructing her safety suggested motivations she could not yet fathom. On the morning she was deemed well enough to leave her sickbed, Eleanor brought her a selection of clothing that had been hastily procured from local merchants. There were skirts of dark wool and cotton, blouses with high necklines, and the fashionable leg-of-mutton sleeves that marked the current decade. There were undergarments of fine linen, stockings, and shoes of polished leather. Evangeline stood before the mirror in her room and barely recognized the woman gazing back at her. The girl who had entered the convent at 18, who had been swallowed by the religious habit for 7 years, was visible only in fragments. In the shape of her eyes, in the curve of her mouth, this woman before her was something else entirely. She was free. When she descended the grand staircase to meet James Blackwood for the first time in waking consciousness, her hands trembled. He stood in the entrance hall, silhouetted against the light filtering through the tall windows, and he appeared exactly as she had glimpsed him in her fever dreams. A man of considerable height and bearing, with features that were more severe than handsome, more calculated than warm. His dark eyes assessed her with an intensity that made it difficult to breathe. "Miss Shaw," he said, his voice precisely modulated. neither warm nor cold, but somewhere in the careful distance between. I trust you are recovering adequately. Eleanor informs me that you have agreed to assist with my correspondence and business matters. I find myself in considerable need of secretarial assistance, and she believes you possess the necessary educational background for the position. I am grateful for your kindness, Evangeline heard herself say, the words formal and inadequate. I cannot repay such generosity. James's expression did not soften, but something flickered in his eyes, a momentary fracture in his professional composure. You need not repay anything. Consider it a matter of practicality. I have work that requires attention, and you have considerable need for occupation and purpose. He paused, his gaze traveling across her face in a way that felt less like observation and more like interrogation. We will establish a routine beginning tomorrow morning. My study is the second door on the left from the main corridor. 9 o'clock shall be the hour we begin. Eleanor will show you there. It was, Evangeline realized as he turned to leave, the most perfunctory welcome imaginable. Yet beneath the careful distance he maintained, she sensed something else, a quality of profound and deliberate restraint, as though he were holding himself at a distance through sheer force of will. As she watched him depart, she found herself wondering not what he wanted from her, but rather what he was afraid she might discover if he allowed himself to draw too close. The first weeks of Evangeline's employment established a rhythm that gradually transformed the isolation of her confinement into something resembling a life. Each morning at 9 o'clock, she presented herself at James Blackwood's study with her hands steady and her mind prepared for the meticulous work of organizing his correspondence, reconciling his accounts, and transcribing his business communications. The study itself was a sanctuary of leather-bound volumes and mahogany furnishings, with tall windows that overlooked the gardens of Prairie Avenue. James had positioned her desk adjacent to his own, close enough that they could work in proximity, yet maintaining the careful distance that propriety demanded. What began as purely professional exchanges gradually evolved into something more complex. As Evangeline organized his papers, she encountered letters and documents that revealed the machinations of his business dealings, the relentless calculations by which he had constructed his empire. She observed how his mind worked, the precision of his reasoning, the ruthless logic with which he evaluated opportunity and risk. When she encountered a discrepancy in one of his contracts, she pointed it out with careful deference, her hand trembling slightly as she indicated the problematic clause. Instead of dismissing her observation, James had leaned back in his chair, studying the document with renewed attention, and then had looked at her with an expression that suggested she had revealed something he had not expected. "You have a keen eye for detail," he said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been surprise or perhaps approval. Most people would have missed this entirely. It was a small moment, yet it marked a subtle shift in their dynamic. James began asking her opinions on matters beyond simple clerical work, soliciting her thoughts on contract language and business strategy. Evangeline, educated through 7 years of voracious reading in the convent library, discovered that she possessed opinions worth sharing. She had studied philosophy and literature, history and economics, subjects that a woman of her era was rarely expected to engage with seriously. Yet James listened as though her thoughts carried weight and merit. One afternoon in December, as snow began to fall softly beyond the study windows, James set aside his work and rose from his chair. He approached a bookshelf that dominated one wall of the study and began to examine the volumes with deliberate attention. "You have spent considerable time in silence since your arrival," he observed without turning to face her. "Eleanor mentioned that you were a woman of education before your circumstances changed. I wondered what you thought of my collection." Evangeline rose uncertainly from her desk and joined him before the shelves. She scanned the titles with growing amazement, recognizing works she had read and others she had only glimpsed in the convent library's more restricted sections. There was Dante and Shakespeare, philosophy texts by Descartes and Locke, treatises on political economy, and novels that would have been considered scandalous had she openly acknowledged reading them within the convent walls. "You have works that were forbidden to us," she said softly, reaching toward a volume of Mary Wollstonecraft's writings. "We were permitted to read only texts approved by the church. Everything else was considered dangerous to the soul." James removed the volume from the shelf and placed it in her hands, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment, a contact so fleeting it might have been accidental, except for the deliberate slowness with which he withdrew his touch. "Then I believe you have considerable reading to undertake," he said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he was offering her more than simply access to books. He was offering her a world that had been denied to her. Over the subsequent weeks, Evangeline's evenings transformed. After her work in the study concluded, she would retire to a small sitting room that Eleanor had quietly made available to her, carrying whichever volume James had selected that day. She immersed herself in texts she had been forced to abandon years before, discovering ideas and philosophies that made her feel as though her mind was awakening from an extended sleep. And each morning, when she returned to the study, James would ask her thoughts on what she had read, engaging her in conversations that ranged across centuries and continents of human thought. It was during one of these conversations, on a particularly bitter evening in late December, that something shifted fundamentally between them. James had been discussing a contract negotiation that had proven unusually complex, and Evangeline had suggested an alternative approach based on principles she had encountered in an economic treatise she had been reading. James listened intently as she explained her reasoning, and when she finished, he did not respond immediately. Instead, he rose from his chair and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his silhouette dark against the frost-covered glass. "You possess an extraordinary mind," he said finally, still facing away from her. "It troubles me that such a mind was permitted to be confined, constrained, denied any meaningful engagement with the world." He turned to face her, and the expression in his eyes was intense, in a way that made her breath catch in her throat. "I wonder what other constraints have been placed upon you. How many parts of yourself have you been forced to bury in the name of obedience and propriety?" The question hung between them, charged with implications neither of them was prepared to acknowledge directly. Evangeline felt heat rise to her cheeks, and she looked away, her fingers trembling slightly as she set down the pen she had been holding. She was uncertain how to respond to such a question, particularly when asked with such obvious emotional intensity by a man she had been taught all her life to regard with careful reserve. "I am grateful for the opportunity you have provided," she said, her voice barely steady. "Few men would have offered employment to a woman in my circumstances. Few would trust me with such work, or permit me access to such literature." James moved closer, and the careful distance that had defined their professional relationship seemed to collapse. "I did not shelter you from charity alone," he said quietly. "There are reasons I made the choices I made, reasons I cannot adequately explain. But understand that your presence in this household has affected me in ways I did not anticipate, and that I find myself increasingly unable to maintain the professional distance that propriety demands." Before Evangeline could respond, Eleanor's knock at the study door interrupted the moment. The spell that had enveloped them shattered like glass, and James retreated once more behind the mask of professional composure. Yet as Evangeline left the study that evening, she understood that something fundamental had transformed between them. The careful architecture of deception and professional distance was beginning to show cracks, and neither of them possessed the will to repair it entirely. Now, I invite you to leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this exciting story. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late January, delivered by a courier in formal livery who bore the insignia of the Shaw family solicitors. Eleanor placed it on James's desk with the careful precision of someone accustomed to handling matters of delicate importance, her grey eyes meeting his in a moment of silent understanding before she withdrew from the study. James recognized the handwriting on the envelope immediately, the precise script of a lawyer trained in the conventions of formal correspondence. He did not open it immediately, instead allowing it to rest on his desktop while he completed the work before him, though his concentration had become fractured and uncertain. When he finally broke the seal, the contents proved to be exactly what he had anticipated, yet hoped might be avoided. The letter inquired, with the careful diplomacy of legal language, regarding any knowledge James might possess concerning the whereabouts of Miss Evangeline Shaw, who had disappeared from St. Mary's Convent under circumstances the family found troubling. It suggested that if Mr. Blackwood had harboured the young woman without the family's knowledge or consent, there might be legal consequences resulting from such harbouring of a person of unsound judgment who had abandoned her religious vows and familial responsibilities. The tone was measured and courteous, but beneath the formal language lay an implicit threat: return the woman or face the consequences of defiance. James set the letter down and pressed his fingers against his temples, feeling the familiar tightness that preceded one of his infrequent headaches. He had known from the moment he brought Evangeline into his household that discovery was inevitable. He had simply not anticipated how quickly the machinery of social obligation and legal authority would mobilize in response to her absence. He rose from his chair and moved to the window overlooking the Chicago street, where the winter sun cast pale light across snow-covered sidewalks and the facades of neighboring mansions. The study door opened without a knock, suggesting Eleanor had anticipated his need before he himself had fully recognized it. She entered carrying a silver tray with coffee and the small pastries she knew he preferred when facing difficult decisions. As she set the tray on a side table, she observed his face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read the subtle shifts of expression that others might miss. "The Shaw family has discovered where she is," James said without preamble. It was not a question. "It was inevitable," Eleanor replied, arranging the cups with deliberate care. "The family employs investigators. The convent itself has connections throughout Chicago society." Miss Shaw's appearance at the gates of this house during that storm was observed by at least 2 people who have loose tongues and connections to people who would be interested in such information. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of something she had been considering for weeks. "The question is not whether they would discover her location, Mr. Blackwood, but rather what you intend to do now that they have." Before James could respond, there came a commotion from the hallway beyond the study. Raised voices, Eleanor's assistant attempting to prevent someone from entering. The study door burst open with dramatic force, and Victor Ashford strode into the room with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his way. He was James's rival in the steel industry, a man whose business practices mirrored James's own in their ruthlessness, though Victor lacked the intelligence that tempered James's worst impulses. Behind Victor came another man, older and bearing the unmistakable appearance of someone engaged in mercenary business. "Blackwood," Victor said, his voice carrying a note of false camaraderie, "I have come on a matter of considerable delicacy. This gentleman is employed by the Shaw family, and he has authorized me to deliver a message on their behalf." Victor smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression. "It seems that a certain young woman has taken refuge in your household under circumstances both curious and questionable." The family is prepared to be reasonable about the matter, provided you cooperate." James remained motionless, his jaw tightening as he regarded his rival with barely concealed contempt. "You have no business in this household, Ashford. Nor do you have any standing to conduct affairs on behalf of the Shaw family. I suggest you remove yourself before I have my staff escort you to the street." Victor's expression hardened, and he moved closer, his voice dropping to something more menacing. "You fail to understand the situation, my friend. Your reputation in Chicago society is already precarious. There are those among the business elite who view your methods as becoming increasingly erratic. Should it become known that you have harbored a young woman of questionable mental stability, a woman who abandoned her religious vows under mysterious circumstances, well, the implications for your standing would be catastrophic. Your business partners would have legitimate cause for concern regarding your judgment. Your contracts could be challenged. Your credibility would be severely compromised." The implicit threat hung between them like a blade suspended above water. James understood perfectly what Victor was suggesting, that information regarding Evangeline's presence in his household could be weaponized in Chicago's business community, that his rivals would use such information to undermine his standing and threaten his commercial interests. More significantly, he recognized that Victor was personally motivated by jealousy and competitive animosity. Victor had long sought to outmaneuver James in the steel industry, and this situation presented an unexpected opportunity to strike at him through vulnerability rather than direct competition. "I require time to consider the matter," James heard himself say, his voice steady despite the rage that burned beneath his controlled exterior. "You will leave my house now, and you will convey to the Shaw family's representative that I will respond to their inquiry within a fortnight." Victor's smile widened, suggesting he interpreted the delay as capitulation. "I am certain the family will appreciate your reasonableness," he said, moving toward the door, "though I would suggest you move quickly. Rumors have a tendency to spread, particularly when they are of such an interesting nature. By week's end, half of Chicago will know that James Blackwood harbors a runaway nun." When the men had departed, Eleanor moved to close the study door, her movements deliberate and slow. James remained standing at the window, his mind racing through the implications of what had transpired. The careful fiction he had constructed to protect Evangeline was crumbling. The business community would use this against him, would see it as evidence of compromised judgment. More significantly, he recognized that his continued presence in his household placed Evangeline in an increasingly vulnerable position. He descended to the sitting room, where Evangeline had begun spending her afternoons when her secretarial duties concluded. She was reading when he entered, a volume of poetry held delicately in her hands, her face illuminated by the winter light filtering through the windows. When she looked up and saw his expression, her own face paled, and she rose immediately, the book falling forgotten to the carpet. "What has happened?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "Your family knows you are here," James said without preamble. "There will be demands for your return. There will be threats. There will be attempts to separate us, using whatever leverage they can construct." He moved closer, and when he spoke again, his voice carried an intensity that seemed to vibrate through the air between them. "The question before us now is whether you will permit them to succeed. Now I invite you to leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this exciting story." The library of James Blackwood's mansion had become the war room where he orchestrated his response to the threats closing in from all directions. Maps of Chicago's financial districts were spread across mahogany tables, alongside documents detailing Victor Ashford's business dealings, correspondence from the Shaw family's lawyers, and reports compiled by investigators James had hired within hours of receiving the threatening letter. Eleanor moved through the space like a silent sentinel, ensuring that coffee remained hot and that the household staff was instructed to maintain absolute discretion regarding the papers and conversations occurring within those walls. James had not slept in 36 hours. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his dark hair disheveled from the repeated passage of his fingers through it as he worked through the logical architecture of his predicament. He had spent his entire adult life constructing strategies to eliminate competitors and consolidate power, yet this situation demanded something different. For the first time, his personal desires and his business interests stood in direct opposition, and he found himself forced to choose which he was willing to sacrifice. The investigator James had employed, a grey-faced man named Thorne who specialized in exposing financial improprieties, entered the library carrying a leather portfolio bulging with documents. His expression was grim as he placed the portfolio on the desk before James. Inside lay evidence of Victor Ashford's embezzlement from the construction company he purportedly managed, fraudulent contracts designed to redirect funds into accounts held in pseudonymous names, and more significantly, connections to individuals involved in organized crime operations throughout Chicago's industrial sector. The quantity and quality of the evidence was overwhelming. It was enough to destroy Victor Ashford completely. "The man is a criminal," Thorne said flatly. "What you have here is sufficient to bring charges that would result in imprisonment. His business associates would abandon him immediately should this information become public. His reputation would be obliterated." James studied the documents in silence, his mind calculating the implications of using such information. He understood what releasing this evidence would accomplish. It would neutralize Victor as a threat, would demonstrate to the Chicago business community that anyone who opposed James Blackwood would face devastating consequences. It was precisely the kind of ruthless maneuver that had defined his career and established his dominance in the steel industry. Yet as he contemplated this course of action, something crystallized within him, a recognition that in saving Evangeline through such means, he would be sacrificing something essential to his own soul. He made a decision that surprised even himself. He would release the information regarding Victor Ashford, but not as a weapon wielded by James Blackwood. Instead, he instructed Thorne to deliver the evidence to Chicago's progressive newspapers and to key figures in the city's reform movement. The information would be released publicly in a manner that appeared independent of James's involvement, and it would be framed within the larger context of exposing corruption in Chicago's business elite. Victor Ashford would be destroyed not by James's direct action, but by the machinery of public opinion and legal consequence. Simultaneously, James engaged in direct negotiations with the Shaw family through their legal representatives. He authorized his own lawyers to offer a financial settlement of staggering proportions, enough to compensate the family for the scandal of Evangeline's escape, while securing their agreement not to pursue legal action. The amount was substantial enough that Margaret Shaw herself would struggle to justify rejecting it, and James knew that financial incentive would prove more persuasive than moral arguments regarding his daughter's well-being. Yet, the most significant action James undertook was neither directed at Victor nor at the Shaw family. Instead, he began the systematic restructuring of his own business empire. He divested himself of contracts known to involve environmental destruction and unsafe labor practices. He transferred management of his most ruthless operations to subordinates willing to continue such practices, effectively distancing himself from their consequences while maintaining financial benefit. He began, in essence, to transform himself from a predator into something resembling a legitimate businessman concerned with sustainable enterprise rather than maximum profit extraction. The cost was staggering. James surrendered millions of dollars in potential earnings. Several of his most trusted business associates viewed his actions as weakness and defected to competing firms. Within Chicago's industrial circles, rumors circulated that James Blackwood had become soft, compromised, his judgment clouded by personal matters. Yet simultaneously, his actions generated unexpected admiration among Chicago's emerging progressive movement. Individuals concerned with labor reform and environmental protection, who had long viewed him as an enemy. The man who had been regarded as a ruthless predator was being gradually repositioned as a reformed magnate capable of conscience. The most delicate negotiation involved the church itself. Through Eleanor's carefully cultivated connections and James's substantial financial donations, arrangements were made to secure Evangeline's release from her religious vows. The ecclesiastical machinery was complex and typically resistant to such petitions, yet James's contributions to the church's various charitable enterprises proved persuasive. Within 6 weeks, the paperwork was completed, and Evangeline was no longer bound by the vows she had taken under duress. It was on an evening in early March when James finally permitted himself to rest. The library had been cleared of documents, the maps and evidence removed, the space restored to its normal state of quiet elegance. He found Evangeline in the sitting room, where she had spent much of the past weeks, largely confined to the mansion as the various negotiations unfolded. She was reading, as always, but when he entered, she set the book aside and rose to greet him. "It is finished," he said simply. "Your family will not pursue the matter further. Your vows have been dissolved. You are legally free from all obligations to the church and to your family." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried an intensity that seemed to fill the room. "But understand that my freedom from the constraints that bound me is less complete. I have made certain compromises that will define the remainder of my life." Evangeline approached him slowly, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him acutely aware of every line, every mark of exhaustion that weeks of relentless work had etched into his features. "What have you done?" she asked softly. "I have become someone I did not anticipate becoming," James replied. "I have surrendered the ruthlessness that defined my career. I have chosen a different path, one that will result in significantly less wealth and considerably more complicated business relationships. I did this not because I am a virtuous man, Evangeline, but because I recognize that certain choices have a cost that no amount of money can compensate for." He reached for her hand, and when their fingers intertwined, it felt like the moment when lightning finds its path through darkness. "The question before you now is whether you can accept what I have become, and whether you are capable of believing that my actions were motivated by something more profound than simple desire to possess you. If this story already made you sigh, leave a like. Every gesture from you helps other souls discover the beauty of love from days gone by." Spring arrived in Chicago with tentative warmth, melting the winter snow and awakening the city to new growth and possibility. The mansion on Prairie Avenue had undergone its own transformation during the months of crisis and negotiation. Where once it had served as James Blackwood's fortress of solitude, a place where he conducted business with ruthless efficiency, it had gradually become something else entirely. A space where two people were learning to build a life together based on choice rather than circumstance or obligation. Evangeline had claimed portions of the household as her own domain, and the changes she implemented reflected her evolving vision of what home could be. The sitting room where she spent her mornings had been restructured according to her preferences, with fresh flowers arranged in crystal vases and shelves reorganized to accommodate the growing collection of books she and James had begun acquiring together. She had discovered a talent for architectural design during lengthy conversations with James about the mansion's layout, suggesting modifications that improved both aesthetics and functionality. Her ideas were implemented without hesitation, as though James had been waiting for someone to grant him permission to reimagine the spaces he inhabited. The most significant transformation, however, was internal rather than visible. Evangeline had begun the complicated process of understanding who she was when stripped of the identities that had previously defined her. She was no longer Sister Catherine of the convent, bound by vows and silence. She was no longer the disgraced daughter of the Shaw family, a burden to be hidden and contained. She was Evangeline Shaw, a woman of education and intelligence, a woman capable of forming her own opinions and making her own choices. This freedom, which she had imagined would feel exhilarating, instead proved complex and occasionally terrifying. Eleanor had become her unexpected confidant during this period of transformation. One afternoon in late April, as Evangeline arranged flowers in the library, while Eleanor supervised the household staff, the older woman paused in her work and regarded Evangeline with an expression that suggested she had been contemplating something of considerable importance. "There are matters regarding Mr. Blackwood that you should understand," Eleanor said without preamble, her practical tone allowing no space for deflection. His first wife was chosen for her family connections and social standing. She was beautiful in the manner society demands, but she was cold, calculating, and entirely without genuine affection for him. I knew her as well as anyone in this household, and I can tell you that their marriage was a union of convenience that satisfied neither party. Evangeline set down the roses she had been holding, her attention fully engaged. Eleanor rarely spoke of James's past, and the fact that she was doing so now suggested she believed the information important. "He blamed himself for her death," Eleanor continued, moving to adjust one of the flower arrangements with precise movements. "She died 3 years ago, under circumstances that were never entirely clear, and James withdrew into his business with an intensity that bordered on self-destruction. He worked constantly, as though remaining in motion could prevent him from feeling the weight of his own complicity in the emptiness of their relationship." Eleanor paused and turned to face Evangeline directly. "What I mean to convey is that your presence in this household has altered him in ways I have been hoping for years to witness. You have reminded him that life consists of more than the accumulation of wealth and power. That is a gift beyond measure, and I believe he understands this, even if he cannot always articulate it adequately." The conversation with Eleanor provided context for understanding certain aspects of James that had previously puzzled Evangeline. She observed how he sometimes retreated into silence during evenings, how certain moments seemed to trigger a distant expression in his eyes, how he occasionally made decisions that prioritized emotional well-being over financial advantage, in ways that suggested he was still learning to trust his own capacity for genuine feeling. During this period, Evangeline also began the delicate work of establishing a different kind of relationship with her family. Her father, who had remained distant during the crisis, reached out through a series of carefully worded letters that gradually revealed his own complicity in the original scheme to place her in the convent. His confessions were painful to read, yet they offered a kind of redemption through honesty. He was a man confronting the consequences of his own cowardice and moral compromise, and Evangeline found herself capable of a fragile forgiveness that surprised her. Margaret Shaw, Evangeline's mother, proved more complicated. She arrived at the mansion one spring afternoon without warning, dressed in the height of fashion yet somehow diminished by the losses her actions had precipitated. The reunion between mother and daughter was conducted in the formal parlour, with Eleanor strategically nearby but discreetly absent, allowing them the privacy that such an encounter demanded. "I have come to understand the magnitude of what I cost you," Margaret said without preamble, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her reticule. "My own shame and fear led me to sacrifice you without genuine consideration for what such sacrifice would mean to your life." She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried the weight of genuine remorse. "I cannot undo what I have done, but I can acknowledge it, and I can hope that someday you might find it possible to forgive me." Evangeline listened to her mother's confession with a complex mixture of emotions. She could not grant complete forgiveness. The years of confinement could not be erased by admission of wrongdoing, but she could recognize that her mother was attempting to atone, attempting to bridge the chasm that her own actions had created. The reconciliation was neither complete nor entirely comfortable, but it was real, and it allowed Evangeline to reclaim certain family relationships while maintaining the independence she had fought so hard to achieve. James observed these reconciliations and transformations from a careful distance, offering support without intrusion. Yet Evangeline was increasingly aware that his own transformation remained incomplete. He continued to work with intensity that sometimes bordered on obsession, though the nature of his work had fundamentally changed. He now engaged in business practices that would have been unthinkable during his earlier career: fair wages for workers, investment in safer working conditions, environmental considerations in industrial operations. One evening, as they sat together in the library, Evangeline broached the subject that had been accumulating weight in her mind. "You have sacrificed much for my freedom," she said carefully. "I recognize that your business empire is diminished, that your influence among Chicago's industrial elite has been compromised by your choices. I wonder sometimes if you regret the path you have chosen." James set down the document he had been reviewing and regarded her with an intensity that made her acutely aware of the physical space between them. "Every person we are capable of becoming requires that we abandon certain previous versions of ourselves," he said quietly. "The man I was would have destroyed Ashford through direct action and then continued precisely as before, accumulating wealth and power without consideration for the human cost. That man would have negotiated with your family and then moved on to the next conquest without genuine reflection." He rose from his chair and approached the window overlooking the evening Chicago skyline. "The man I have become is not perfect. He still carries within himself the capacity for ruthlessness and calculation, but he is capable of recognizing that certain choices have value beyond their financial implications. He understands that love requires sacrifice, and that such sacrifice, if freely chosen, is not diminishment, but rather transformation into something larger than oneself." When he turned to face her again, his expression suggested that he was standing at the threshold of something he was not quite prepared to acknowledge directly. "The question I must answer is whether you can accept this version of myself, the man I am becoming, rather than the man I was." The morning of the wedding arrived shrouded in unexpected clarity, as though the universe itself had paused to acknowledge the significance of what was about to transpire. Evangeline stood before the mirror in the guest chamber that had become her private sanctuary, regarding the woman reflected in the glass with a mixture of wonder and trepidation. The wedding dress had been designed by a seamstress Eleanor had selected with meticulous care, a creation of ivory silk adorned with Belgian lace and subtle pearl embroidery that caught the light with delicate luminescence. The gown possessed elegance without ostentation, beauty without the excessive ornamentation that characterized most society weddings of the era. It was a dress that reflected Evangeline's own sensibility rather than conforming to the expectations of Chicago's elite. Eleanor entered without knocking, carrying a simple coronet of white roses and lily of the valley, their fragrance filling the room with the essence of spring. She fastened the flowers into Evangeline's dark chestnut hair with practiced precision, her grey eyes meeting Evangeline's in the mirror with an expression of profound approval. "You are ready," Eleanor said simply. It was not a question. The ceremony itself had been deliberately designed to defy Chicago society's expectations. Rather than the grand affair typically accompanying the marriage of a wealthy magnate, James and Evangeline had chosen an intimate gathering at the mansion, limited to those who had genuinely supported them through the preceding months of crisis and negotiation. Father Dominic had been invited, his presence serving as both benediction and acknowledgement of Evangeline's spiritual journey. The progressive clergyman who conducted the ceremony was a man known for his willingness to challenge conventional religious doctrine, and he had worked extensively with James and Evangeline to craft vows that reflected their unconventional path to this moment. When Evangeline descended the grand staircase toward the parlor where the ceremony would take place, James was waiting at the base, his formal black suit tailored to perfection, his dark eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that seemed to render invisible everyone else in the mansion. He extended his hand, and when their fingers intertwined, it felt like the culmination of every moment of restraint and careful distance they had maintained throughout the preceding months. The ceremony was conducted with quiet dignity, the words exchanged between them carrying weight that transcended the formal language of traditional marriage vows. James promised not merely to protect Evangeline, but to honor her independence and encourage her to pursue whatever vision of life she wished to create. Evangeline promised not to demand that he abandon his capacity for ambition, but rather to walk beside him as he learned to balance his drive for achievement with consideration for human consequence. When the clergyman pronounced them husband and wife, James drew Evangeline close and kissed her with restrained passion, a gesture that acknowledged the physical desire that had simmered between them for months, while maintaining the dignity appropriate to their audience. The assembled guests, Eleanor and the household staff, Father Dominic, Margaret Shaw, James's closest business associates, and a handful of genuine friends, witnessed the moment with visible emotion, understanding that they were observing not merely a society wedding, but rather a union forged through adversity and choice. The evening celebration was modest by the standards of the Gilded Age, yet it possessed a quality of genuine joy that no amount of elaborate formality could have replicated. Musicians played in the drawing room, soft melodies that created an atmosphere of romantic intimacy. There was champagne and carefully selected wines, food prepared under Eleanor's supervision that reflected both elegance and genuine care for the guests' enjoyment. James and Evangeline moved through the celebration together, their hands rarely separating. Their glances communicating across rooms with a language that required no words. Yet as midnight approached and the guests began their departures, a servant delivered a letter to James, bearing the seal of Father Dominic. The priest, who had remained late into the evening, had discovered something in the convent archives that required immediate disclosure. He had arranged for the letter to be delivered discreetly, understanding that its contents demanded James's attention, but that the wedding night should not be interrupted by crisis. It was only after Evangeline had retired to the bridal chamber that James opened the sealed envelope and read the contents that would alter the landscape of their carefully constructed future. The documents Father Dominic had uncovered suggested that Evangeline's father had been complicit not merely in placing her in the convent, but in facilitating financial irregularities that had involved prominent members of Chicago's merchant elite. The conspiracy extended far beyond the Shaw family, implicating individuals of considerable social standing in schemes designed to conceal embezzlement and fraud. The knowledge that Evangeline's escape and James's subsequent actions had been built partially upon incomplete understanding of the full scope of the conspiracy struck with the force of a physical blow. The carefully orchestrated resolution that James had negotiated with the Shaw family suddenly appeared fragile, constructed upon foundations that were themselves unstable. Morning brought complications that threatened to unravel the piece they had so carefully constructed. Evangeline, discovering the letter when she woke, read its contents with growing horror, her hand trembling as she processed the implications. "My father was part of a criminal conspiracy," she said quietly, her voice hollow with shock. "Everything I believed about my family, about why I was placed in the convent, appears to have been built upon lies layered upon lies. There is no simple scandal to hide. There is corruption, deliberate deception, criminal activity." James moved to embrace her, but she pulled away gently, needing distance to process the emotional upheaval. "What does this mean for us?" she asked. "Will your involvement in my case be viewed as complicity in covering up these crimes? Will your business reputation be further damaged by your association with my family?" The questions hung between them like an accusation. Though Evangeline had not intended them as such, James understood that she was grappling not merely with disappointment, but with the recognition that her own liberation had been built partially upon incomplete knowledge of the circumstances that had created her imprisonment. "It means," James said carefully, "that we must make a choice regarding how we respond to this revelation. We can attempt to conceal it, to protect your family and my own interests through silence and strategic maneuvering. Or we can choose to acknowledge the truth and accept whatever consequences that acknowledgement produces." He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried the weight of genuine uncertainty. "I will not dictate what you choose, Evangeline, but I will tell you that if we choose the path of truth, it will require courage that may exceed what either of us anticipated requiring. It will demand that we sacrifice the comfortable fiction we have constructed and face the world with complete honesty regarding both your family's actions and my own complicity in covering them through financial negotiation." Evangeline gazed out the window toward the Chicago skyline, where the morning light was beginning to illuminate the city's towers and structures. She recognized in this moment the choice that would define not merely her marriage, but her entire understanding of who she was capable of becoming. She could choose comfort and protection, or she could choose truth and its inevitable consequences. "Tell me what you believe is right," she said finally, turning to face James. "Not what is expedient or profitable or socially acceptable. What do you believe is right?" James moved to her and took her hands in his, their intertwined fingers communicating across the physical space between them what words could not adequately express. "I believe that truth, however difficult, is preferable to lies, however comfortable. I believe that you have suffered enough from secrets and deceptions created by others. And I believe that we are strong enough to face whatever consequences our honesty produces. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone you love. That way, we'll know that the romances of the past still live in the hearts of today." The decision to speak truth arrived not as a moment of dramatic clarity, but rather as a slow accumulation of certainty that alternatives had become impossible to sustain. James and Evangeline worked together with their legal representatives to construct a comprehensive disclosure that acknowledged the conspiracy implicating Evangeline's father and the network of Chicago merchants who had participated in the financial fraud. The process required weeks of careful documentation, of gathering evidence and testimony, of constructing a narrative that was simultaneously honest and strategically positioned to minimize unnecessary collateral damage. What distinguished their approach from typical legal maneuvering was its fundamental commitment to transparency rather than self-protection. They arranged for simultaneous disclosure to Chicago's progressive newspapers, to city officials, and to the business community. The revelation was framed not as an accusation that James Blackwood was distancing himself from, but rather as a confession of his own complicity in initially covering up certain aspects of the conspiracy through financial negotiation with the Shaw family. The public response arrived like a tempest that threatened to sweep away everything they had constructed. Chicago's newspapers seized upon the scandal with enthusiasm, their headlines alternating between accusations of criminal conspiracy and admiration for the moral courage displayed by James and Evangeline in bringing the matter to light. The business community fragmented into factions, some viewing their actions as admirable and demonstrating reformed conscience, others regarding them as naive idealism that threatened the carefully maintained structures through which wealth protected itself. Victor Ashford, having already survived one public scandal, attempted to weaponize the revelation against James, suggesting that the entire disclosure was simply another calculated maneuver designed to rehabilitate James's reputation while eliminating competitors. Yet Victor's credibility had been so thoroughly destroyed by previous exposure of his own criminal activities that his accusations found little purchase in the public consciousness. Instead, his efforts to exploit the scandal served primarily to confirm that he possessed neither the intelligence nor the moral standing to mount any meaningful challenge. The legal consequences unfolded across months of depositions, investigations, and ultimately prosecutions. Evangeline's father, confronted with irrefutable evidence of his participation in the conspiracy, underwent a personal reckoning of profound depth. Rather than attempting to evade responsibility, he made the decision to fully cooperate with investigators, providing testimony that implicated other members of the conspiracy and fundamentally altering the trajectory of several high-profile trials. His cooperation resulted in a more lenient sentence than might otherwise have been imposed, yet it came at the cost of public humiliation and the effective destruction of his social standing. Margaret Shaw, observing her husband's choice to accept responsibility, began her own process of confrontation with the consequences of her previous actions. She became an unexpected advocate for reform within Chicago society, using her remaining influence to support organizations working toward greater transparency in business practices and protection of vulnerable individuals. Her transformation was neither complete nor entirely convincing to those who had witnessed her previous complicity, yet it represented a genuine attempt at atonement. Evangeline discovered she was pregnant during the period when legal proceedings were unfolding with relentless intensity. The revelation came not as simple joy, but rather as a profound intensification of the emotional complexity that defined their lives. She was bringing a child into the world at a moment when her family was fractured, when the man she had married was navigating the ruins of his former empire, when her own identity remained unsettled and evolving. Yet she also recognized that this child would be born into a world built more honestly than the one she had inhabited before meeting James, a world where truth had been prioritized over convenience. The pregnancy necessitated a period of enforced rest during the final months, physical confinement that became paradoxically liberating. As Evangeline's body slowed and stilled, her mind expanded into territories of contemplation and reflection. She spent hours reading, writing in the journal James had provided, engaging in long conversations with James about what kind of parents they wished to become and what values they wanted to transmit to their child. James remained at her side with a devotion that seemed to consume all his other activities. He read to her, discussed her reading with genuine engagement, shared his fears about fatherhood and his hopes for their child's future. In these quiet moments, stripped of the relentless activity that had previously defined his existence, James discovered dimensions of peace he had never known. He began to understand that the business empire he had spent decades constructing had been, in some essential way, a distraction from the genuine work of learning to love and be loved. Evangeline gave birth to a daughter on a spring morning in 1887, exactly 1 year after her escape from the convent. The labor was difficult, requiring the attendance of the finest physicians Chicago could provide. Yet when the infant emerged into the world, her cries seemed to announce not merely the arrival of new life, but rather the redemption of the choices that had brought her parents together. James held his daughter for the first time with a tenderness that transformed his entire demeanor. He was a man who had built steel empires and orchestrated the destruction of rivals. Yet he held this small, fragile human being as though she contained all the meaning and purpose that had previously eluded him. He named her Catherine after Evangeline's convent identity, ensuring that the woman Evangeline had been was honored rather than erased by the woman she had become. In the months following Catherine's birth, James's business underwent further transformation. He formally dissolved his participation in the most ruthless operations, transferring those interests entirely to other parties and using the proceeds to invest in enterprises focused on worker welfare and environmental protection. The financial sacrifice was substantial, yet James discovered that the satisfaction of building something genuinely beneficial exceeded the pleasure he had previously derived from pure profit accumulation. Evangeline established herself as a woman of independent intellectual authority, beginning to publish essays on women's education and the dangers of institutional confinement. Her work, though published under a pseudonym to avoid excessive public scrutiny, began to influence discussions within progressive circles regarding the need for educational reform and greater protection of individual autonomy. She became known among certain reformist communities as a voice advocating for genuine change rather than superficial modification of existing systems. The reconciliation between Evangeline and her parents evolved gradually across the ensuing years. Her father, serving his sentence with quiet dignity, wrote letters to his daughter and grandchild that revealed a man engaged in genuine spiritual transformation. Her mother, stripped of much of her social influence, discovered unexpected peace in the diminished circumstances, finding meaning in her relationship with her grandchild and in the gradual rebuilding of connection with her daughter. 5 years after the events that had brought James and Evangeline together, they stood on the balcony of the mansion overlooking Chicago, with their infant son beside their daughter, watching the city's lights begin to illuminate as evening descended. The empire James had built remained profitable, though substantially smaller than it might have become had he continued his previous trajectory. More significantly, it was an empire constructed according to principles that he could defend without moral compromise. Evangeline reflected on how the terrified young woman who had escaped the convent in the rain had become someone entirely unanticipated. She possessed agency, voice, and genuine partnership in building the life she inhabited. She had not achieved perfect happiness or complete redemption, but she had achieved something arguably more valuable, a life characterized by genuine choice, mutual respect, and the daily work of building something meaningful with someone she loved. James, observing his wife and children, recognized that whatever he had surrendered in terms of business empire, he had gained infinitely more through the courage of choosing authenticity over advantage. They had not escaped the world, but rather had learned to move through it with integrity, choosing to build something enduring rather than merely dominant. The storm that had brought them together had given way to something more profound than passion, a partnership rooted in mutual growth and shared commitment to living deliberately in an era defined by excess and moral compromise. The autumn light filtered through the tall windows of the mansion on Prairie Avenue, casting golden shadows across the library where James Blackwood sat reviewing architectural plans for a new workers' housing initiative. At 49 years old, his hair had become predominantly silver, though his eyes retained the sharp intelligence that had defined him throughout his life. Yet something in his bearing had fundamentally softened. The rigid authority that had once characterized his movements had been replaced by a quieter confidence rooted in genuine peace rather than dominance. Evangeline entered, carrying their youngest child, a boy of 3 years who possessed his father's dark eyes and his mother's thoughtful expression. She had become a woman of considerable intellectual standing within Chicago's progressive circles, her published essays on education and women's autonomy having influenced policy discussions at both the state and municipal levels. At 35 years old, she possessed a radiance that had nothing to do with conventional beauty and everything to do with the peace of a woman who had claimed her own life entirely. Their family had expanded beyond the 2 children born in the years immediately following their marriage. There were now 4, Catherine, who at 7 possessed her mother's keen intelligence and her father's determination; Thomas, at 5, who demonstrated an unexpected artistic sensibility; young William, their 3-year-old, and most recently, a daughter named Eleanor, in honor of the woman who had been instrumental in saving them both. The mansion had been expanded and restructured to accommodate the growing family, each child's room reflecting their individual personality and interests. James had stepped back from direct involvement in most business operations, though he remained financially engaged in the enterprises that had become his life's work. The housing initiative that occupied his current attention represented the culmination of years of thought regarding how wealth could be deployed to create genuine benefit for working families. The project would provide safe, dignified housing at affordable rates, a radical concept in an era when landlords typically maximized profit through overcrowding and minimal maintenance. Evangeline's work had expanded beyond publishing into direct advocacy. She had founded a school dedicated to providing advanced education for girls of all social classes, an institution that had become a model for similar initiatives in other cities. She traveled frequently to deliver lectures, to consult with educators, to advocate for systemic change in how women were educated and what opportunities were made available to them. Her work had attracted both admiration and criticism, yet she had learned to move through both with equanimity. The Shaw family had experienced its own reckoning across the 7 years. Evangeline's father, released from imprisonment 5 years earlier after serving his sentence with quiet dignity, had spent his remaining time working with reform organizations and attempting to mentor younger businessmen toward more ethical practices. He had passed away the previous winter, his death marked by a surprising outpouring of respect from those who had witnessed his genuine transformation. Margaret Shaw had become unexpectedly devoted to her grandchildren, her social ambitions having been replaced by what appeared to be genuine affection and pride in her family's accomplishments. Father Dominic had retired from active ecclesiastical duties, spending his final years engaged in historical research and writing. His chronicle of the events that had brought James and Evangeline together, though not published under his own name, had circulated within certain intellectual circles and had begun to influence discussions regarding institutional reform within the Catholic Church. He had passed into his eternal rest the year following Evangeline's father's death, his funeral attended by an unexpected gathering that included progressive clergy, members of the business community, and the Blackwood family in full attendance. Victor Ashford had ultimately faced legal consequences for his criminal activities, having finally been prosecuted successfully after years of evading justice. He had served a substantial prison sentence and had emerged from imprisonment utterly destroyed, his former social standing obliterated and his financial resources exhausted. James had discovered that he felt no triumph in his rival's downfall, only a weary acknowledgement that the mechanisms of justice, however imperfect, had eventually functioned. Eleanor Hartwell, now aged 73, had become a beloved figure within the household, having been given the honorary title of family matriarch by the Blackwood children. She had been provided with a generous retirement pension and had been permitted to remain in the mansion for as long as she wished, a privilege she exercised by continuing to oversee certain aspects of household operations, and by serving as an advisor and confidant to both James and Evangeline. The marriage between James and Evangeline had deepened across the 7 years in ways that neither could have anticipated. The intense passion of their early relationship had evolved into something more enduring, a partnership characterized by genuine understanding, mutual respect, and the comfortable intimacy of two people who had chosen each other and had continued to make that choice day after day. They worked together on his business initiatives, collaborated on her educational projects, and maintained an intellectual engagement that continued to astonish both of them. Chicago itself had begun to transform in response to the reformist movement that individuals like James and Evangeline represented. Labor conditions were gradually improving. Environmental regulations were being discussed with increasing seriousness, and women's education was becoming a matter of mainstream concern rather than radical advocacy. The Gilded Age was beginning to give way to the progressive era, a transformation that James and Evangeline recognized as partial vindication of the principles they had fought to embody. As Evangeline placed young William in James's lap and settled herself on the arm of his chair, the afternoon light catching the silver strands in her dark hair, both of them recognized the profound blessing of their life together. They had not achieved perfect happiness or complete victory over the systems they opposed, but they had built something genuine, something that had endured through crisis and challenge, something that continued to grow and deepen with each passing year. The storm that had brought them together had long since passed, yet its transformative power remained evident in every aspect of their lives, and in the legacy they were creating for their children and for the world they inhabited. Dear beloved viewers and listeners, we have reached the end of this extraordinary journey, and yet in many ways it is only a beginning. The story of James and Evangeline is not merely a tale of romance set against the backdrop of the Gilded Age. It is a testament to the power of courage, authenticity, and the willingness to choose truth over comfort, even when that choice demands everything we hold dear. In an era defined by excess and moral compromise, two people chose to build their lives according to principles of genuine connection and integrity. James surrendered wealth and power to become someone capable of love. Evangeline escaped the confines that sought to contain her and claimed her own voice. Together, they demonstrated that redemption is possible, that transformation is achievable, and that love, when built upon honesty and mutual respect, becomes a force capable of reshaping not merely personal lives, but entire communities. The lessons woven throughout their story speak to our contemporary moment with surprising relevance. In a world that often demands we choose between ambition and authenticity, between personal desire and social obligation, James and Evangeline show us that a third path exists, one where we can honor our own needs while serving something larger than ourselves. They teach us that sacrifice, when freely chosen, becomes not diminishment, but elevation. They remind us that the most revolutionary act in an oppressive system is to live with complete honesty and integrity. As you reflect upon this narrative, We invite you to engage with the deeper questions it raises. What would you sacrifice for genuine love? What are you willing to release in order to become the person you wish to be? How might you use whatever power and privilege you possess to create more equitable systems rather than exploiting the ones that exist? These are not merely historical questions, but profoundly personal ones that each of us must answer through our own choices and actions. We would be deeply honored to hear your thoughts regarding this story. Please take a moment to share your reflections in the comments below. Tell us which moment moved you most, which character spoke to your heart, what lessons you carried from this journey. We ask you to write a single word that captures your experience, perhaps courage or transformation or redemption, so that we might know that you have traveled this entire path with us, and so that others might discover this story through your engagement. If this narrative has touched your soul, we lovingly encourage you to share it with those you love. Send it to family members who appreciate stories of authentic connection and moral courage. Share it with friends who have struggled with their own choices regarding conformity and authenticity. Distribute it among those who might find hope and inspiration in witnessing two people choose each other and choose integrity, even when that choice was extraordinarily difficult. We have prepared additional stories for you, tales of love and transformation from different eras and circumstances, each with their own unique beauty and wisdom. Please explore the cards appearing on your screen to discover narratives that might speak to your heart. Subscribe to our channel to ensure that you never miss these stories that remind us of the enduring power of human connection, the possibility of redemption, and the transformative force of love across the ages. Thank you, dear friends, for allowing us to share this story with you. May the courage of James and Evangeline inspire you to live with greater authenticity. May their journey remind you that love, built upon truth and sustained by choice, remains the most powerful force capable of reshaping our lives and our world. Until we meet again with another tale from times past, we wish you love, wisdom, and the courage to become who you are truly meant to be.